Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to concentrate on the story that features Ehud. The story appears in the book of Judges, chapter 3. If Ehud does not sound familiar to you, that is because he is one of the most obscure figures in the Bible and participates in one of the oddest of episodes. No one preaches about Ehud. No one tells his story. No one revels in the graphic descriptions about what he did. At the same time, he was a judge in Israel. That does not mean that he presided over court proceedings or interpreted laws. A biblical judge was someone who executed justice in God's behalf. Still, these characters have been conventionally called judges. Whether one can derive religious meaning from Ehud's story is debatable. What is not debatable is how compelling his story is, the gory details notwithstanding. Let's take a look at Judges 3, verses 12 through 30 to be specific. As my listeners know from other podcasts, the first 16 chapters of Judges narrates the material according to a set pattern having 6 elements. Those elements are: 1. Israel does evil in the Lord's eyes. 2. The Lord punishes Israel by allowing them to be oppressed by a foreign power. 3. Eventually, the people cry out under the burden of their oppression. 4. When the Lord hears the cry, the Lord raises up a deliverer to rescue Israel. These deliverers are called judges. 5. In one way or another, the deliverer, or judge, delivers and frees Israel from oppression. 6. The land rests for a while, luxuriating in freedom. In the Ehud episode, Israel, of course, begins by being evil. The nature of the evil is not specified in this instance. Still, regardless of their offense, the Lord strengthened Eglon, a Moabite king, as a possible way to punish Israel. That's in verse 12 of chapter 3. True to form, King Eglon mustered Ammonites and Amalekites and formed a coalition against Israel. This led to Israel's defeat. That's in verse 13. For 18 long years, Israel was under the thumb of Eglon, Moab's king. That's in verse 14. After almost 2 decades of misery, Israel cried out to the Lord. The Lord heard the cry and responded by raising up a deliverer. This deliverer was named Ehud ben Gera, a Benjaminite. Of course, Benjamin was one of the Israelite tribes. At this point, we are given an interesting detail about Ehud. He happened to be left-handed. Anytime a biblical narrative goes out of its way to provide a detail like that, you can be sure that it will be significant one way or another in the story. For now, though, that is all we know about Ehud. He was the son of a Benjaminite man, and he was a southpaw. Somehow, the rest of Israel realized that the Lord had raised up Ehud to deliver them. So, Israel sent tribute to Eglon, the Moabite king, by having Ehud bring the tribute. Tribute is typically a form of taxation. The purpose of this tribute was at this juncture unclear. Was it a regular tax payment that Ehud would bring and then negotiate for tax relief? Was it a gift that Ehud was to bring in hopes that he could induce King Eglon to be less oppressive? Was Ehud asked to bring the tribute and leave the matter at that? Or was Israel expecting him to use his imagination as to how he might deliver the people? This is all in verse 15. While we ponder answers to these questions, we learn that before Ehud is in the king's presence, he had made for himself a two-edged sword that was a cubit in length. That's in verse 16. Having made the weapon, he placed the sword under his clothes. That is when we understand the significance of Ehud's being left-handed. For the place that his sword would be under would not only be under his clothing, but on his right side. Obviously, one normally has a sword available on the opposite side of one's dominant hand. A right-handed person would draw a sword from a weapon sheathed on his left side. The opposite would be the case with a left-handed man. If one did not know beforehand what a person's dominant hand was, that person would more likely think that a weapon would be on the left side. That is simply because there are so many more people having the right hand as the dominant hand. In any case, when Ehud approaches the king, he has a concealed weapon under his clothes on his right side. When Ehud begins his audience with King Eglon, he presents him with the tribute. That's in verse 17. Right then we are given another curious detail. The narrator lets us know that King Eglon was a very fat man. Once again, such details are not extraneous in biblical narrative. The detail will have a role to play in the story. Are we told that the king is fat to emphasize that he has gotten fat because of his oppression of Israel? Are we told that the king was fat as a way to emphasize how this fat cat was lording it over Israel? Are we told that the king was fat as a way for the narrator to make fun of the Moabite king? We shall have to wait to see how the story ends to determine an answer. As soon as Ehud delivered the tribute to the king, he had those who had helped him carry it leave the room. Then there is a curious comment. At first it seemed that Ehud had stayed in the room with the king when the gift was presented. That's in verse 18. Apparently, however, he had himself left with the other carriers. At that point, he turned back at something called sculptured stones, in Hebrew, psalim. These psalim refer to worship objects that would be forbidden to Israelites in that they elicited devotion to another deity, or even deities. It turns out that this is more of a metaphor than a spatial or geographical reference. That is, Ehud turned back at a place suggestive of improper worship. This may hint at the evil Israel had committed in the first place. Such a violation would be consonant with other displays of disloyalty to the Israelite God on the part of the Israelites. By Ehud's turning back, he was symbolizing moving away from such forbidden worship. In any case, once he turned back from the sculpted stones at Gilgal, Ehud soon found himself once again in King Eglon's presence. This time, Ehud was alone. That's in verse 19. Then he said to King Eglon, "I have a secret message for you, O king." Evidently intrigued, the king told everyone in the room to be quiet. He wanted to hear this message. But because it was a secret, the king also had the royal attendants leave the room. Eglon and Ehud are all at once by themselves. This happened in the king's cool chamber, which was located on the palace roof. At this point, Ehud identified the secret message as something that had come from God. That's in verse 20. As Ehud approached the king, presumably to tell him the message from God, with his left hand he reached to his right side and withdrew the two-edged sword, thrusting the weapon into the king's considerable belly. That's in verse 21. The narrator describes this luridly. Ehud pushed the blade into the fat man's belly up to the sword's hilt. The fat of the corpulent king closed over the hilt. The assassin basically eviscerated the king, for we learn that, quote, dirt came out from Eglon's body. Ehud immediately escaped by going out into the vestibule while locking the doors of the king's chamber behind him. That's in verse 23. As Ehud fled, the king's servants went back to the doors of the room. When they saw that the doors were locked, they figured that the king wanted a little privacy. Why? Because the king was relieving himself. This explains why Ehud had been so violent in killing the king. The eviscerated bowels caused the odor. When the servants smelled this, that is when they concluded that the king was going to the bathroom. So the servants waited, allowing Ehud to have even more time to get away. That's in verse 25. After waiting for an uncommonly long time, the servants suspect that something was wrong. They fetched a key, opened the doors, and found King Eglon dead, lying on the floor. Ironically, Ehud once more passed by the pusilim, the sculpted stones. The Hebrew word means not only that talked about Ehud's locomotion, means not only to go by, but to trespass, thus symbolically making fun of these idolatrous objects. That's in verse 26. Ehud goes right on to Serah, a town in the hill country of Ephraim. Once there, he mustered troops and encouraged them to follow after him. His appeal was that the Lord had given the Moabites into Israel's hands. Of course, Moab had oppressed Israel for the last 18 years. Ehud led these soldiers into battle and scored a decisive victory. That's in verse 29. That ended Moab's oppression and eventuated in 80 years of Israelite freedom. That's in verse 30. Having dealt with these grisly details, it is not hard to understand why no preachers want to treat this story. Even though King Eglon elicits no sympathy, he was the victim of a clever assassin, an Israelite assassin at that. Plus, the murder was brutal. The deception was pronounced. The scene was grim. Even the final battle against Moab left no survivors. It seems that violence, Israelite violence, is glorified everywhere one looks. What is the moral of such an account? There is none, of course. This is why one cannot read this story moralistically, looking for heroes and villains. It has to be read theologically. That is, what is God's role in the story? There are a few things to keep in mind. 1, the Moabite oppression was at first instigated by God as punishment for Israel's evil. 2, there are limits to oppression. In time, oppressors push these limits and set themselves up for eventual comeuppance and defeat. 3, even though God punishes Israel, divine judgment is not the final answer. Once Israel cried out under the bondage, God decided to rescue them. That is why God raised up Ehud as a deliverer. That raising up was an act of divine grace. 4. Ehud's tactics were his own doing, according to the text. To be sure, God raised up a left-handed man, but it was Ehud's ingenuity that enabled him to carry out this famous hit. Still, God used this nefarious strategy. 5. God is not above the fray of human affairs, even when these affairs are nasty and brutish. Quite often, perhaps most often, it is impossible to understand God's involvement or exactly what God is doing. In this instance, the Lord responded to Israel's lament, raised up Ehud, who did what he thought he had to do, and liberated Israel. Israel had rest for a few generations before once more again he was guilty of evil, and God led them once again to oppression. That was a perpetual condition on Israel's part, according to the book of Judges. This is only one story in that account. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know your emails are, what your emails are, so that I can contact you when we're ready for our mini courses. It will happen, I promise you. And also, if you want to ask me a question that I will answer in a subsequent question and answer period, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.